Hello, this is the second part of the analysis of the fire that took place on board USS Bonhomme Richard starting on July 12, 2020. My name is Mercogliano. I'm a former merchant mariner, been a firefighter for the past 20 years, and now I'm a maritime historian. I want to go back and look at some of the events that took place during that first day with additional footage, and then look at the days that have transpired over the course of the fire. These scenes are provided by On Scene TV, and I pulled them off the internet for us to take a look at. Here you see the initial response in units of Federal Firefighting and San Diego Fire Department responding to the call. The previous video had most of the scenes that we had were taken from helicopters and from the water view. These scenes are going to be a little different as we're going to get a little closer view here and get some scenes from the pier. You can see the initial response coming in. Not a very fast response in there in some ways. You see trucks arriving. Fire has not really taken off yet in large measures. Still see a lot of smoke coming from the vessel. But again, at this point in the fire, we haven't seen the degree that we'll see this fire break out into. And you'll see units initially arriving in here and coming in. Initially, this fire is going to morph into a 3-alarm fire with quite a large response. Those two comments are really significant. So first, securing utilities, gas, and electric on board the vessel. Typically, firefighters will do this on shoreside structures. You want to make sure that there's no chance of electrocution, that there's gas explosions, all that kind of stuff is done on board shore. On board ship is a whole different matter. Without the onboard electricity to power things like the fire mains and the fire pumps, then that situation could be that now you're fighting that fire solely using the equipment that's pier side and on the water and no longer on the ship. That's going to put fighting a fire on board that vessel at a severe disadvantage. The second thing you heard there were bottles shooting off. And that goes to the reason behind this fire, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But secondary are these bottles going off. Could be acetylene, could be oxygen bottles heating up. They can't vent off fast enough, so they start popping off, blowing off. And they'll start shooting across bays and areas. And you hear the crews going defensive. They're going up onto the flight deck to fight this from the flight deck. The problem with being up on the flight deck on this vessel is the heat's going to build up on that deck very quickly. The way to fight this fire is to get from the side or from below through the well deck or through the side ports. And that's something that the fire department looks like they readjust to do shortly. The initial call for fire on the Bonhomme Richard was an explosion in the lower V deck. There's a lot of debate about what can cause that explosion. Down in the lower vehicle deck, there could have been hazardous material. There could have been other material down there that initiated the fire. Very unlikely it was due to because of yard work. It's a Sunday morning. Probably not a lot of welding going on Sunday morning. One of the things I have heard from a representative from NASCO, the shipyard, was it could be electrical. There are two sources of electricity in the lower vehicle deck, lighting, which is 110 volt, but more importantly, the ventilation is 440 volt. And 440 volt, if the transformers blew or if a phase line kicked off, that could account for the large explosion that took place on board the vessel that initially kick off this fire. Makes a lot of sense. Not 100% sure that's the cause. The initial response here, you'll see there's an aerial device set up on the port quarter of the vessel. Only one aerial device. Kind of surprising. I would expect to see more aerial devices, but again, without a clear view of that pier, could be obstructions. The aerials may not have been able to get down there further. And then there are 2 hose lines going in on the port side elevator into the structure. So if you watch the previous video, we talked about the issue about what was known about the Bonhomme Richard. And here you see that report coming in that there's no munitions on the vessel, and then there's a caveat, there are munitions on the vessel, but they're nowhere near the fire. And again, that clarification is very big. As long as they know that this vessel is basically inactive vessel coming out of a shipyard, doesn't have aircraft on board, doesn't have a lot of the explosives that you would typically see on board a vessel, it's not there. So here's the initial response. Again, Fed Fire and San Diego Fire Department are the initial call-ins for this, and that's typical when you're pier side. You'll call shoreside fire department. The officer at the deck will initiate that. There'll be an initial attempt to try to get this fire knocked down as quickly as they can. Problem you have, again, is Bonhomme Richard is in a yard period, doesn't have full complement on board. A lot of the crew members haven't even been living on board. I think the indication was only a few crew members have just shifted on board, so you do not have a lot of crew members on board to fight this fire. One of the interesting things that will come out in the investigation, and the investigation is key. Everything I am relating to you is done by somebody who's 3,000 miles away and getting secondhand information, viewing videos, and I am telling you right now, whatever I'm telling you is my own opinion. It is not grained in any sort of concrete evidence. It is worth the electrons you're watching this video on. But one of the interesting indicators here, too, is, okay, you have this vessel on fire. Right across from them are 2 vessels. You have the Fitzgerald, which is the closest to you, and the Russell. What's the responses of those 2 vessels? According to reporting by USNI News, Gitche Fuentes did a great interview with the chief of Fed Fire, Mary Anderson. And one of the things that initially happened is there was a series of explosions that happened on board the vessel. And you heard the bottles going off. We had the reports of the initial explosions, and according to the reports, this came across the pier. You would expect Russell and Fitzgerald to put away their fire, to send off their fire parties to assist in this fire on board. And according to any reports I haven't seen yet, more than likely that did happen. I would assume that firefighting parties from both of those ships were called away. The other thing that you could have those 2 vessels do is provide water to this fire. Both those vessels are operational. They can get their fire pumps up and running, and more importantly, supply water to engine apparatus, fire trucks on the pier, pull off hose teams, and again, start putting this fire out. Again, we're going to talk a lot about the response by Navy crews on board, which was absolutely heroic and amazing. The question is, was that an ad hoc deployment, or was there a pre-plan in the Navy base in San Diego to deploy that way? That call, we're going defensive, pull everybody out. They had already talked about moving the crews up onto the flight deck. They had already talked about explosions on board the vessels, bottles flying across. So now they've decided to pull everybody off the vessel, basically to abandon the vessel. Again, the issue here, more than likely, is safety issues. A question of accountability, a question of, is everybody safe? And so one of the things you'll see here is they will start withdrawing the crews. They have already pulled that aerial down. They've gotten everybody off the weather deck, off the flight deck area. Kind of hard to see here as you visualize this, but the question is, it looks like that even the hoses may have been pulled off. You'll see some apparatus on the pier right there. There is some other video out there that showed the crews getting back on board, Russell and Fitzgerald, and images of fire crews withdrawing from the pier and coming back out at the time. And so this decision is made to go to defensive, to kind of go ahead and stop fighting the fire, allow the fire to burn, and reassess. That is done a lot in shoreside fires. If a fire seems to be getting out of control and you don't want to risk your crews in the interior, you'll pull them back, reassess, make a new plan, and then go back in and attack. Not commonly done on board ship fires. Ship fires, obviously, you can't just get off the vessel and then come back on. Typically, you have to attack those ship fires on board because that is your only method of staying afloat without getting in the rafts. Again, this is the change that's going on here. You're dealing with a fire on a ship that is shoreside. Once you make that decision to withdraw and go into a defensive stance, you're going to allow the fire to build. And you'll see that in the video here. You'll start seeing that fire build. This is pre the wind really kicking up, early morning if you've ever been to San Diego. Pretty calm in the morning. Late in the afternoon, you'll see the wind start kicking up, and that had been an issue in that. We saw that noted in the CNO's statement, the issue of having to deal with the wind, especially in that large area on the side ports of Bonhomme Richard, where the wind would come in from the side on the hangar deck and the upper vehicle deck and then run down the length of the vessel through the well deck and the hangar deck. But one of the things you'll start seeing here is this fire building. You'll see the change in the color of the smoke, much darker, much more black. It means it's getting more fuel. The fire is getting to the point where it's building, that it's not getting pure, clean combustion, and so you're just getting more and more smoke coming out. Again, not unusual to see these reassessments in shoreside fires. But again, one of the things that you have to be able to do is adapt and get in there. The question is that operability between Fed Fire and San Diego Fire. Is San Diego going to go back in there with Fed Fire and fight that? Big issue, again, is shoreside firefighters have a lot of experience fighting fires. They do it all the time. It's not unusual for shoreside firefighters to fight multiple fires in a day. Navy firefighters don't typically fight that many fires. I sailed for 3 years, and I can tell you of 2 fires I had on board a vessel. One was a lightning strike on a mast that lit the paint on fire. The other was just a fire in a stateroom that we put out with CO2 extinguishers. And again, I may not have the experience to talk about this fire, but the only people who have experience talking about a fire of this size are those who fought this fire. This is a epic fire. This is a career fire right here. And one of the things you're seeing here is that fire build. Notice how the smoke is starting to cover over the Fitzgerald and the Russell right now. Getting on the pier, that could impact engine operations for fire trucks actually on the pier. So the decision to pull back, and they pulled back all the way off the pier. They abandoned the pier, which is, again, going to be a judgment call. It is the on-scene commander's decision of what to do, and I will not question their decision. Their decision was based on safety of the crew, and that's what they determined to be the best course of action to do. When you do withdraw, you want to reassess and then go back in there and start, again, hitting those fires again. Question is, could they have been hitting fires from on board Russell and Fitzgerald at that time? Could they have moved in fireboats across the pier, pulled Russell and Fitzgerald off the pier sooner? One of the things you notice is Russell and Fitzgerald are slowly being consumed by the smoke here. They're there for 5 hours. That's a long time for them to be there. Again, the question is, what are they providing in this time period? This is a situation that is building. It is growing at this point, and important for reassessing. Fire departments are structured like militaries, battalions, companies, squads. And so you need to start bringing in resources. One of the things we see in this video that's used here is the calling for additional alarms will come in. So more units are coming in, more personnel are coming in. And again, what you want to do is be able to hit this fire hard and fast and try to get a knockdown on it. You'll need to come at it from a different way. You're not going to be able to come at it from the top. That flight deck is going to start getting hot. One of the things that's happened with Bonhomme Richard is her flight deck's been modified to handle F-35s, meaning that flight deck, especially the after part where the F-35s land, is designed to resist heat. If it can resist heat from the top, it's going to resist heat from the bottom. And what you're going to see is just the heat build up in those hangar decks, the upper V deck, and the well deck area quite immensely.
Chicago, USS Bonhomme
So my previous video covered a lot of this information by this point, where the fire had gone defensive and what fire actions and what fire prevention, actions were being taken at this time. This is the point when the San Diego Harbor Police had arrived. They were using their fireboats off the side of the ship to start spraying water. In the meantime, the crews are reassessing to come back on board here. Mutual aid coming in. You're getting additional alarms coming in, so more trucks, more units rolling in here. At this point, I'd imagine that across the harbor front of San Diego Navy Base, you're seeing Navy crews called away. One of the things I've seen in numerous reports is the proactive nature of the ships to put together equipment, start putting together fire teams, and start sending them over. We're going to talk about that in a little bit more. But again, the question becomes, is that ad hoc or had that been planned? Is there a fire response plan in place for a major base like San Diego or Norfolk or any of these bases, that in case of a fire on board a neighboring ship, that there is a fire team that can be put together, and what equipment to bring, what sort of material to bring, or is it just, hey, let's grab everything we can and let's get down there to the pier and let's do it, which is great. It's fantastic. It's what makes our Navy a fantastic Navy. You see that time and time again in times of difficulty and distress that happen. But again, a formal plan is always a good one to have. One of the things you're seeing here is this fire billowing, and it's growing in scope and scale right now. You're starting to see that black smoke roll off. If you saw our earlier video, that is the smoke that's coming from the non-skid paint that was in barrels up on the hangar deck. That is cooking off at this point, providing that really dark black smoke in this video we're seeing right now. It also caused a little bit of consternation among some people because they were thinking it was getting into the fuel tanks. And if you got into those fuel tanks, about 1 million gallons of fuel on board Bonhomme Richard. She usually carries about 1.8 million and about another million of aviation fuel. So she was under 50% fuel capacity at this time. Not unusual. She needs fuel on board for ballast reasons, but also to run machinery as she's coming out of the shipyard. Still had several months of shipyard work going on, and that's why she's such in poor kind of fire integrity, watertight integrity, and smoke integrity stayed on board the vessel, because hatches have been removed, there's piping, there's scaffolding, a lot of material on board. Talking to the firefighters and seeing what I've viewed over this time, it was really difficult. One of the things they were concerned about going into the vehicle decks and the hangar decks with this large scaffolding, because of the non-skid that was being applied to the flight deck, this new kind of heavy-duty non-skid, and because of the heat from the F-35s, which is a vertical takeoff jet, you had to move a lot of electrical, a lot of stuff that ran along the top of the hangar deck had to be moved. So there's a lot of scaffolding in place in that area. And heating, once it hits that scaffolding, will cause it to collapse. It doesn't take long, just a little over 500-degree heat will start fatiguing metal, and all of a sudden you have scaffolding coming down. And what you don't want to be is inside a large hangar deck and having equipment raining down on top of your head. It's a massive security hazard for you, safety hazard, excuse me. So one of the things you never have enough of in a fire is fire crews. You just don't. There's never enough personnel on a fire scene. You can always use more people. One of the things that you're going to do is go through firefighters very quickly. There's only so many times you can strap on an SCBA, a self-contained breathing apparatus, go into a very hot environment, wear that PPE, that personal protective equipment, and fight a fire until you're exhausted and you can't go back in again. Matter of fact, it's standard procedure after going into an interior attack to get your blood pressure checked, to have a paramedic check you out to make sure you are rehabilitated to go back in. So that means personnel. That means a lot of personnel. You need more and more personnel going in there. And for the young crews going in, especially the Navy crews that had not experienced a fire like this, I've done Navy firefighting before, and one of the things you do is you go into the simulators. They're great. They're fantastic, actually. They're some of the best are out there. But at a flip of a switch, you can turn off that fire. You can't turn off that fire on board Bonhomme Richard, and it's a little bit of a different environment to go in. One of the things that came out of that interview that Guille Fuentes did, again on USNI News, is how the Fed fire chief was able to marry up experienced firefighters with new firefighters. And you'll be able to tell a difference, too. The Navy firefighting gear, the red helmets, smooth red helmets, much different than the stylized helmets used by Fed Fire, San Diego Fire, you'll see. The other issue here is San Diego Fire is released fairly early. At the end of the day, the first day, San Diego Fire is released. And one of the things that we're going to see is Fed Fire is going to call in for its off-duty firefighters, not just from San Diego, but from neighboring bases. And again, that's because they have experienced Fed Fire in dealing with industrial-sized fires, and more importantly, they operate under the rules and organizations of Fed Fire. And so that's a big change that we see taking place here. This fire, by the end of the evening, will just kind of all of a sudden take off on the cruise. The fire will vent up into the superstructure, and right there at the end of the day, we'll see that fire kind of burst through the bridge and the forward island there and begin to consume the vessel. And that takes us into the firefighting that takes place over the next couple of days. And that's what I want to talk about here is how the firefighting takes place over these individual days. So there were several attempts in the evening to get on board the vessel and do some firefighting. Very difficult at night, very difficult in that environment on board Bonhomme Richard. No illumination, zero visibility on board, plus you have structural weakness of the hull, the integrity of the vessel, until you can get NAVC and a few other Navy personnel on board to attest to the structural integrity of the vessel. You're going to be worried about it, especially the island. The island was compromised, the superstructure, and so you're really concerned about it. So one of the things you want to do is amass your resources in the morning to make an attack first thing, and you see that. They're bringing Navy crews on board. Again, you can identify them fairly easily by what you see. I will have one little comment here. There's an image here coming up of the crew from the Decatur coming on board, marching in process. Looks great. Looks a fantastic view, but they're wearing their face masks. And I have to say that any firefighter would not put their face mask on until the last moment possible. Very hard to breathe in that. You sweat up. Just, again, a difference between Navy firefighters and shoreside firefighters. That took place during this time was the introduction of HSC-3 on H-60 helicopters, bringing in aerial drops, Bambi bags. That's what they're referred to. They're able to dip those into the bay and fill them up with several hundred gallons of water. I'm not sure the size of the bags they were using, and dropped them. Something I've never seen before. You never really see that used on structure fires for a variety of reasons. Number one, it's really hard on the structure. You're dropping a lot of water on them. But one of the things that they brought HSC-3 in to do this is to really target areas where the fire was burning through and breaking through. They couldn't get on the flight deck. The flight deck was so hot, they couldn't really get on there. They were worried about the superstructure coming down. They really wanted to avoid hitting the superstructure with the tugboat cannons, the water cannons from shore, for fear of pushing over the superstructure too. And so HSC-3 is going to come in and really target the structure. This right here, I think, is one of the unsung stories of the event, and that is the arrival of Sea Tractor 9 Pier side, where the Russell and the Fitzgerald had been. Sea Tractor 9 is going to rig up its fire main to provide water for the firefighting ashore. they had to come up with a system that not normally used. They had to dismantle part of their fire main, pull a manifold out from the hold, and get Sea Tractor 9 pumping ashore. It was a really key moment. Again, it goes back to that fireboat issue I talked about in the previous video. Such a key thing that was missing from San Diego, in my opinion. Operations continue into the night of July 13th. Fire crews rotating in, maintaining that fire presence on board the vessel, fighting the fire up forward. It's gotten into the staterooms, the honeycomb area in the forward part of the ship. It's in the superstructure, and the ship begins to develop a list to the starboard and forward as water is sprayed on board. So 48 hours into this fire, and they're still combating fire in the superstructure, fire up forward, and hot spots throughout the vessel. These are some of the first images we really get of the work on the pier. And one of the things you see there are fire monitors set up on the ground, cooling the hull, and extended on those big high cranes right there. Again, didn't get those aerials in there, but they were able to mount monitors in there. One of the things that you don't think about in a fire, especially a shipboard fire, is the amount of climbing up and down ladder wells you're going to have to do. Here you see crews climbing up on the port side elevator to get into the vessel. Definitely a challenge for them. Another issue is command of this structure. That was Captain Scott Thorman right there. He's the overall commander of the vessel, the commanding officer. Typically on a ship, Navy commissioned vessel at sea, in port, he would be directing these operations. But again, the Bonhomme Richard's in a difficult position coming out of the shipyard. And so there has to be coordination between him and the shoreside firefighting crews. The logistics involved in a fire of this size is enormous. The amount of equipment you'll need, personnel you'll need, rotations, food, logistics, you name it, is a battle. But some of the most powerful scenes I think that come out this day are those of the firefighters. The Navy firefighters, the Fed Fire crews, just really going in and battling hard on this structure. It is quite a massive endeavor to get this fire under control in the ship, and it's going to take all day still, and they're still going to have hot spots throughout the vessel. The fourth and last day of the fire is going to go for almost 100 hours. The imagery you saw there was water being sprayed on the forward part of the vessel, helos dropping water again up in those forward compartments, which again are very tough to get into because of the shipyard work. Crews are battling this now for 4 days, obviously tired, obviously exhausted, going in. A lot of federal firefighters were brought in from neighboring areas, neighboring bases. Crews of U.S. Navy ships are rotating in at this point. They're marrying up teams and going in, and it's just a series of mop-ups. Salvage and overhaul is the worst part of any fire they're involved, and you definitely see that on board Bonhomme Richard. You start getting some images afterwards. You get the CNO, Admiral Gildays, on board, along with the Fed Fire Chief, Mary Anderson, surveying the damage on the vessel. The CNO talked about the fact that 11 out of the 14 decks were damaged. And then you start getting these images of the ship. The other image you have here is the vessel shifting its listing forward and then to the port side. Not a good situation for on board. One of the issues you have on board a ship is every gallon of water you put into it, you have to get it off. Not so much a big issue at the beginning of this fire because you're spraying on the hangar decks and the well deck and the vehicle decks, more so up forward. But the damage is extensive throughout this vessel as you start seeing these images come out and you see the damage across the many decks, the charred, stairwells are burned, hatchways are burned, the deck itself. Remember, even though you tend to think steel doesn't burn, the paint burns on it. Material in the vessel burns on it. And you get a vessel hot enough, it starts radiating that heat throughout the vessel. They're talking about salvaging the vessel. This vessel was commissioned in 1998. It's a steam-powered vessel. It's going to be extremely expensive. I envision this vessel as a constructive total loss. That amount of heat, 1,200, 1,500 degree heat above the hangar deck would have bowed the hangar deck. The hangar decks obviously would have to be redone. Most of the vessel would have to be redone. You start looking at this vessel and it becomes very clear that without a huge amount of money, almost more expensive to fix the vessel than to repair the vessel, it's what you would usually call a constructive total loss. Last images really demonstrate the extent of damage to the vessel. Obviously, the most prominent thing is that forward mast up against the superstructure, but more importantly, the deck underneath that mast is what gave way. It wasn't the mast itself. So the entire superstructure, the entire island structure there is gutted. You can see the char marks there out the side port of the vessel. You see that on both sides of the vessel. That indicates that heat was just billowing out. It's not smoke. That's not smoke. That's heat damage right there. And that's the hangar deck, and right below it is the upper and then the lower vehicle decks. That's where this fire originated. You can see that charring right there, a very good indicator of the extent of the fire. This is the image of the superstructure from the flight deck. You can see how the aluminum steel right there is melted. There's holes on the side of this superstructure. And you'll see when you see access ports into the vessel along the flight deck there, you'll see that charring above it. Just the amount of heat that radiated out there is just phenomenal. And so that entire flight deck from the superstructure aft, that's the way you're looking at it from the helicopter, has been compromised. You would literally have to scrape the entire top of this vessel off, get down to just a deck or two above the water line, and that's what you could salvage. And it's almost inconceivable that that ship would be saved. Analysis is just a quick snapshot very shortly after this fire took place, and it shouldn't minimize the role that the crew on board Bonhomme Richard, the adjoining Navy vessels provided, Federal Fire Department, San Diego Fire Department, all the forces that really mustered to fight this fire. It's an epic fight. It is a career firefight right there. And the fact that no one died, that they were able to eventually extinguish this fire and really get it under control and prevent its spread is a testimony to the fortitude of the crew of the Bonhomme Richard and their motto, "I have not yet begun to fight."